The crisp autumn air of Oak Haven, Connecticut crept in through the crack in the window, but inside the Caldwell mansion, the warmth of the fireplace and the sparkle of crystal created a bubble of immaculate perfection. The family, a pillar of New England high society, was celebrating the launch of their newest luxury resort. Richard Caldwell, the gray-haired patriarch with an unwavering posture, raised his glass for a toast, his speech about legacy and success echoing through the dining room. Beside him, Beatrice, the matriarch, was the picture of elegance, her smile perfectly rehearsed, though it never reached her eyes, which held a perpetual sadness. Seated among the guests, the youngest daughter, Eleanor, Ellie, a 28-year-old architect with her father's observant gaze, felt the weight of the performance. She loved her family, but she detested these nights when they played a role for the world, especially tonight. 20 years. It had been exactly 20 years since the family's bubble of perfection had first been pierced. As one of the guests praised the Caldwells' exemplary family, Ellie's mind betrayed her. A distant clap of thunder outside was enough to transport her back. She was 8 years old. The memory was a feverish blur, the sound of rain beating violently against the windows, her parents' muffled shouts coming from the study, her brother Leo's face, then 20, pale and angry. And then, the front door slamming with a force that shook the walls and a heavy, definitive silence. The next morning, they told her Leo had run away. Months later, that he was dead. But the image her childhood memory refused to erase was of her mother, on her knees, scrubbing a dark red stain from the immaculate white marble floor of the entryway. Ellie blinked, returning to reality. The toast was over, and the sound of polite conversation once again filled the air. But for her, the silence of that night 20 years ago continued to echo. She felt it in the way her parents never again spoke Leo's name, in the stiffness of her father's shoulders whenever he looked at his son's old room, now a guest room that was never used. The celebration felt like a farce to her, a banquet served on a tomb. It was then that the sharp buzz of the main entrance intercom cut through the party's murmur. A vulgar, unexpected sound that didn't belong in that controlled environment. Everyone fell silent. The butler, Arthur, answered and, after a moment, returned to the dining room, his normally impassive face as pale as wax. He leaned in and whispered something in Richard's ear. The transformation in her father's face was something Ellie had never seen. The control, the confidence, the authority. It all crumbled into a mask of pure terror. Beatrice saw her husband's expression, and her crystal glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. "Richard, what is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. But Richard didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the security camera monitor near the door, where the image showed a man standing in the rain. A middle-aged man, his face marked by time and pain, but with the same eyes as the 20-year-old boy who had disappeared that night. The ghost of the Caldwell family had come home. The hurried departure of the guests left a heavy artificial silence in the dining room, broken only by the sound of crystal shards being swept up by the butler. Leo stood in the entryway, soaked by the rain, a figure out of place in the polished luxury of the house. His 40-year-old face was a mask of exhaustion, but his eyes, the same eyes Ellie remembered, scanned the room, absorbing every detail. Richard Caldwell was the first to break the silence, his voice devoid of any paternal emotion, cold as steel. "What do you want, Leo? Money? If that's it, name your price and disappear before dawn." Beatrice, beside him, sobbed quietly, her body trembling. She didn't look at her son. She looked at her husband, as if awaiting an order on how to feel. Ellie, ignoring her father's icy tone, took a step forward. "Leo, it's me, Ellie." He finally focused his gaze on her, and for the first time a spark of emotion broke through his facade. An almost imperceptible nod. The conversation that followed took place in Richard's study, a sanctuary of mahogany and power. Leo sat down, refusing the drink his father automatically offered him. He didn't ask for money. In fact, he didn't ask for anything. His presence was his only demand, and that was what terrified Richard the most. "You can't stay," the father said, his voice a controlled hiss. "Your presence here, it ruins everything. Everything we've built on your sacrifice." The word sacrifice hung in the air, heavy with a meaning Ellie couldn't decipher. Leo simply replied, his voice hoarse from disuse, "I'm tired of running." Later that night, Ellie found him in his old room, now an impersonal guest room. The walls that once held rock band posters were now a sterile beige. "Why are they so afraid?" she asked in a low voice. Leo looked out the window at the darkness of the garden. "Because they know the ghosts they buried don't stay dead forever." The tense calm lasted less than 24 hours. The next morning, as the family had a silent breakfast, Richard's personal phone rang. It was a number he recognized immediately, and his face lost all color. He answered, his voice tense. "Yes?" On the other end, an aged voice, still full of venom, replied, "I hear your ghost decided to come back to town, Richard. 20 years is a long time to wait for justice." It was Marcus Preston, the patriarch of the rival family whose feud with the Caldwells was a legend in Oakhaven. Richard hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at Leo, who was sitting at the table, and for the first time, the fear in his father's eyes was replaced by something much more dangerous: fury. The precarious truce, built on the lie of Leo's death, was over. His return hadn't just brought back the past, it had brought back the war. And with this threat from the past resurfacing, the fragile peace of the Caldwell family is about to explode. If you need to know what secret they buried 20 years ago, help us continue this story. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the reveal. Now let's get back to the drama in Oakhaven. Marcus Preston's threat was not an empty one. The next day, a lawyer arrived at the Caldwell mansion with a formal notice. The Preston family was petitioning the district attorney to reopen the case of their son, Julian Preston's disappearance, citing the reappearance of Leonardo Caldwell, the last person seen with Julian that night, as new evidence. The news hit like a bombshell, turning the mansion into a luxury bunker. Richard confiscated cell phones and forbade anyone from leaving the property. His strategy was total control, the same one he had used 20 years ago. But he hadn't counted on Ellie's determination. Suffocated by her father's paranoia and her mother's terrified silence, Ellie knew she could no longer live with fragments of a memory. She needed the truth. While Leo remained isolated, a ghostly figure within his own home, Ellie began her own investigation. She locked herself in the library and dove into online newspaper archives from that year. The news from the time was vague. Julian Preston, 19, disappears after argument. Friend Leo Caldwell, 20, flees home the same night. It all fit the story her parents had told her, but it was too simple, too clean. It was then that she found something her mind had blocked. A small wooden box at the bottom of her old childhood closet, where she kept treasures. Inside, there was a small piece of dark blue fabric, stained with something that looked like rust. Suddenly, her fragmented memory gained a new detail. It was the color of the shirt Leo was wearing that night. With the piece of fabric in her hand, she confronted her mother, Beatrice, whom she found in the conservatory, trembling despite the heat of the greenhouse. "I remember this," Ellie said, her voice firm. "I remember you cleaning the floor, Mom. What happened that night?" Beatrice crumbled. The tears she had held back for 2 decades came in a torrent of pain and guilt. She confessed everything. She told her that Leo and Julian had had a violent fight in the garden over a gambling debt of Julian's that threatened the reputation of both families. In a fit of rage, Leo pushed Julian, who fell and hit his head on one of the stone statues in the garden. Death was instantaneous. It was an accident, a terrible accident. But in the panic, Richard saw only ruin, the scandal, the prison sentence, the fall of the Caldwell empire. And so, he made a decision. That night, while the storm hid their actions, He and Beatrice buried Julian Preston's body somewhere on the family's vast property and sent Leo far away, with the promise that they would bring him back when everything was settled. A promise they never kept. Ellie listened, the blood running cold in her veins. The stain on the floor wasn't wine. Her brother wasn't a runaway. He was in exile. And her parents, the pillars of her life, weren't just protectors. They were criminals. Armed with the terrible truth, Ellie no longer saw her father as a pillar of strength, but as the architect of a lie that had consumed her family. Her confrontation with Richard was not in the heat of emotion, but in the cold silence of his study. "I know everything," she said, her voice steady, devoid of tears. Richard didn't flinch. He set down his pen, his calculating eyes meeting hers. "Then you know what had to be done to give you the life you have. Every luxury, every opportunity was built on the foundation of that night. Leo's sacrifice ensured our survival, and you will not destroy that." His lack of remorse was more shocking than the crime itself. For him, it wasn't about morality, but about power, and Ellie was now an uncontrolled variable in his perfect equation. Realizing she would find no humanity in her father, Ellie sought out her brother. She found Leo on the back porch, looking out at the vast, dark expanse of the property. "Mom told me," she said softly. It was the first time she saw him break down. A dry sob escaped him, the sound of 20 years of guilt coming to the surface. He told her his version, the fight, the push, the panic, and the terror of seeing his own father look at Julian's body not with horror, but with a frightening strategic clarity. "He looked at me and said, 'You disappear tonight,'" Leo recounted, his voice choked with emotion. "He didn't exile me to protect me. He exiled me to protect the family name." In that moment, they were no longer just siblings, they became allies, the only ones who shared the weight of the truth in that house of lies. The external pressure intensified. Marcus Preston, cunning and relentless, leaked the story of Leo's return to the press. Within hours, news vans were parked outside the imposing gates of the Caldwell mansion. The police obtained a warrant and scheduled an official search of the property for 2 days later. Time was running out. If the police found the body, the narrative would be controlled by Richard or the Prestons. Leo's truth, that of a tragic accident, would be buried along with him. "I remember one thing," Leo said suddenly, his eyes scanning the darkness. After everything, my father told me to hide in the old barn." The sound of the shovel hitting the dirt. It came from the direction of the old oak tree, the one that was struck by lightning. It was the only clue they had. That same night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Ellie and Leo snuck out of the house armed with shovels and flashlights. They needed to find Julian Preston first. As the first shovel broke the damp earth beneath the oak tree, hundreds of feet away, hidden among the trees, a small red light from a night vision camera flickered on, recording their every move. The sound of a shovel hitting something hard and hollow was the signal. After an hour of frantic work, Leo and Ellie found the remains of Julian Preston, wrapped in a decomposing tarp. The silence of the night was broken not by a scream, but by a heavy sigh from Leo, the sound of a 20-year burden settling. At that exact moment, as if in a macabre play, powerful floodlights inundated the garden, blinding them. Figures emerged from the darkness. It was Marcus Preston, his lawyer, and the local police who had been alerted by the private investigators watching the property. They had their proof. The trap was set. The commotion brought Richard and Beatrice out of the house. Seeing the scene, the hole in the ground, the bones, his children covered in mud beside it, Richard wasted no time. His mask of shock quickly gave way to one of calculated fury. "Arrest him!" he yelled to the sheriff, pointing at his own son. "He's a monster. He killed the boy and confessed everything to me just now. He forced his sister to help him dig up the body to get rid of the evidence." For a moment, Richard's plan seemed to work. The narrative was simple, brutal, but he hadn't counted on his children having changed. "That's a lie," Ellie said, her voice echoing with a strength that surprised everyone. including herself. And then, Leo stepped forward, into the light. "I pushed him," he said, his voice clear and steady, addressed not to his father but to Marcus Preston. "It was a stupid fight. He fell. I didn't mean to kill him. I was a scared kid and I made a terrible mistake." The raw, honest confession hung in the air. Richard laughed, a bitter sound. No one's going to believe a runaway murderer. It was then that the last piece of the puzzle moved. Beatrice, who had been watching everything in silence, took a step forward, moving past her husband as if he didn't exist. In her hands was a small leather-bound diary. She handed it to the sheriff. "I wrote everything down, that very night," she said, her voice weak but resolute. "Every detail of Richard's plan to cover up the accident and send our son away. 20 years of silence is enough." A year later, the Caldwell name was no longer synonymous with power, but with scandal. Richard was sentenced to a long prison term for obstruction of justice and concealment of a corpse. For his confession and cooperation, and for Beatrice's testimony, Leo received a reduced sentence for involuntary manslaughter and was about to be released on parole. The Oak Haven mansion was sold. Beatrice now lived in a modest house in town, slowly rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. Ellie visited Leo every week. Their conversations were no longer about the past, but about the future. Leaving the detention center that day, Ellie looked up at the sky. For the first time in 20 years, the air felt lighter. The silence was not heavy or oppressive. It was just peace. The truth, however ugly, had finally set them free. If this powerful story about family secrets and the price of silence moved you, don't leave without supporting us. Give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more dramas like this, and comment down below what city you're watching from. Hit the notification bell and explore our channel for other stories that will keep you hooked until the very end.